Have you ever wondered, like, how one event can just completely change everything? I mean, like, what if a wrong turn in Sarajevo back in 1914, just a little detour, started World War I?
That's what we're looking at today.
Exactly. Today we're doing a deep dive into Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the guy whose assassination basically lit the fuse.
And it's fascinating because, well, he's usually painted as this, like, warmonger, this villain.
Right, right.
But was he really? Like, was that the whole story?
Yeah, that's the question.
So to really dig into this, we're going to be using a conversation between historians Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland.
Oh, from The Rest is History, right.
Yeah, their podcast. It's really insightful.
I love their stuff. Okay, so, Franz Ferdinand. Let's start with the basics.
All right, so he's born in 1863.
Middle of the 19th century.
Yeah, a time of massive change in Europe. And he's born into this incredibly powerful family, the Habsburgs.
Ruling a huge empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Exactly.
Can you imagine the pressure of that legacy?
Oh, absolutely. Growing up knowing you're basically destined for greatness, but also, all those expectations, all that tradition weighing you down.
And it wasn't even a straight shot to the throne for him, right?
No, not at first. His cousin, Crown Prince Rudolph, was the heir apparent.
Rudolph. Bit of a wild one, wasn't he? Reminds me of some of those royal scandals we see today, yeah?
Oh, yeah, totally. Rudolph had this passionate affair with a woman named Mary Wetzer.
Scandalous for the time.
Huge scandal. And it ended tragically.
Tragically.
Suicide pact, 1889.
Wow. A royal suicide pact. That's intense.
It shook the empire. And suddenly Franz Ferdinand is thrust into the spotlight, the new heir.
But I get the feeling not everyone was happy about it.
You're right. Emperor Franz Joseph, the ruler at the time, he was very traditional.
And by traditional, you mean?
Well, let's just say he was known for being quite cold, very strict, obsessed with routine. He even slept on an iron bed.
An iron bed.
Yeah. Not exactly the picture of comfort, right?
No, not really. Guess you don't get to be emperor by being a softie.
No, you don't. And this rigidity, it extended to his relationships too, including with Franz Ferdinand.
So even though Franz Ferdinand is now the heir, he's dealing with a distant, disapproving emperor.
Pretty much.
But that's not even the half of it, is it?
No, because then Franz Ferdinand falls head over heels for someone the emperor deemed completely unsuitable.
Oh, this is where the drama really starts. Who was this woman?
Countess Sophie Chotek.
Ah, forbidden love. Classic.
The Habsburgs, they had incredibly strict rules about marriage. Like, these weren't just suggestions, they were laws. And the biggest one was that your spouse had to come from this tiny group of elite families.
Like some exclusive club,
Exactly. And Sophie, while she was an aristocrat, she didn't make the cut.
But Franz Ferdinand was determined to marry her.
Absolutely. He was deeply in love.
So we have this guy, supposed to be a staunch conservative, defying the emperor himself for love.
It's ironic, isn't it?
What did Franz Joseph think about all this?
He was not happy. Saw it as a challenge to his authority, to the whole dynasty. There were negotiations, compromises.
Compromises. I have a bad feeling about this.
Well, they did eventually let Franz Ferdinand marry Sophie, but there was a catch, a big one. It had to be a morganatic marriage.
Morganatic? What does that even mean?
It basically meant Sophie would never be empress, even though she was his wife.
Oh, wow.
And their children, they wouldn't be in line for the throne either.
That's harsh. I can't imagine the humiliation.
It was a huge blow, especially for Sophie, constantly reminded of her lower status, even at official events.
So what did their life look like after this morganatic marriage? Did they just, disappear from public life?
Not completely. They spent a lot of time at their estate, Canopus Castle. And it's interesting because here we start to see different sides of Franz Ferdinand's character.
Oh, like what?
Well, for one, he was a passionate gardener. He absolutely loved roses, created some of the most beautiful rose gardens in Europe at Canopus.
Really? The heir to the throne, tending his roses?
Yeah, it's a bit unexpected, right?
It is. It doesn't exactly fit the image of the stern Archduke we usually hear about.
Exactly. But then on the flip side, he was also a very avid hunter.
Avid how?
We're talking obsessed.
Yeah.
He kept records of his kills. Huh. Tens of thousands of animals.
Wow,
yeah.
That's a lot of hunting trophies.
He had a whole room dedicated to them at Canopus. So yeah, very, very much a man of contradictions.
The gardener and the hunter.
And there's one more thing that really sheds light on him.
What's that?
His travels, he went all over the world. Egypt, India, Japan, even the U.S.
The 19th century version of gap year?
Kind of, yeah. He wrote extensively about his experiences, took tons of photos. There's even one of him dressed as a mummy in Egypt.
Wait, what? Dressed as a mummy. I have to see that picture.
Oh, it's great. It shows a different side of him. But beyond all this, the hunting, the travels, Franz Ferdinand was really wrestling with a big question:
Which was?
the future of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah, because things weren't exactly stable, were they?
No. Nationalism was on the rise. Different ethnic groups were demanding more autonomy. It was a powder keg.
And Franz Ferdinand, he was trying to figure out how to diffuse it.
He was. He had ideas about how to reform the empire, save it from collapse. And some of them, they were quite radical, especially coming from a supposed conservative.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. What exactly did he have in mind?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it.
All right, so last time we were talking about Franz Ferdinand and this big question looming over him, the future of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah, he could see the cracks forming, all this rising nationalism, different groups wanting more autonomy. He knew something had to change.
Like trying to hold together this massive, diverse empire that's pulling in different directions.
Exactly. And he believed the only way to save it was through reform, modernization, giving more power to those different ethnic groups.
We talked about his ideas being kind of radical, right? Especially for a conservative.
Yeah.
So what exactly did he have in mind?
He actually had 2 main plans, both pretty bold, both challenging the status quo. The first was, well, he called it a tripartite monarchy.
Tripartite, so like splitting the power 3 ways.
Yeah, essentially. It elevated the Slavs, put them on the same level as the Germans and the Hungarians.
A 3-pronged power-sharing system.
Mm-hmm.
I can already imagine that went over well.
Especially with the Hungarians.
Yeah, they were already pretty powerful within the empire.
They saw it as a direct threat, to their autonomy, their influence. And this is actually where we get to a really interesting and maybe even controversial side of Franz Ferdinand. He really disliked the Hungarians.
Seriously. I mean, he was going to be their king, wasn't he?
It's true. He didn't hold back his opinions, though. He thought their treatment of minorities, especially the Romanians and Slovaks, it was oppressive, damaging to the empire.
So it wasn't just a personality clash. It was tied to his whole vision for reform.
Exactly. He felt the Hungarians were holding the empire back, clinging to their dominance instead of adapting to the changing times. He even called them, and I'm quoting here, a bunch of mustachioed gypsies.
Wow, okay. Not mincing words there.
Nope. But let's move on to his second plan, this idea of a United States of Greater Austria. Now, this is really fascinating.
It sounds kind of like a precursor to the European Union, right?
Yeah.
Centuries ahead of its time.
Right. He wanted to divide the empire into 16 semi-autonomous states, each with its own parliament, a degree of self-governance.
So, like, keeping them united under the Habsburg crown, but giving them more freedom.
Yeah, creating a system where different nationalities could, coexist peacefully and equitably.
It really makes you think, what if he had succeeded? Would the map of Europe look totally different today?
It's a question historians still debate, but unfortunately, as we know, history had other plans. And those plans, well, they lead us to Sarajevo.
Yeah, to that fateful day in June 1914.
Sarajevo was a powder keg at the time. Bosnia, where Sarajevo is located, it was a relatively new addition to the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
They'd annexed it just a few years earlier.
Yep, in 1908. And there was a lot of resentment among the Serbs living there.
They felt like they belonged to Serbia, not Austria.
Exactly. There was this strong sense of Serbian nationalism. Many, especially the younger generation, they yearned for unification with Serbia.
So while Franz Ferdinand is thinking about a more inclusive empire, these groups are actively plotting to break it apart.
It was a clash of ideologies, a recipe for disaster, and fueling those Serbian nationalist sentiments were groups like the Black Hand.
That was a secret society, right?
Yeah, committed to Serbian unification, even if it meant resorting to violence.
So knowing all this, knowing how tense the situation was, Franz Ferdinand still decides to visit Sarajevo.
It was a calculated risk, a show of strength, but also a risky move. He'd even received death threats before the trip. There's this almost chilling anecdote about him joking that someone might try to shoot him in Sarajevo.
Wow, almost like a premonition.
He went anyway. Partly a sense of duty, maybe, but he also believed in symbolism. The visit was planned for June 28th, a significant date for the Serbs, marking a historic battle.
He wanted to extend an olive branch, show his commitment to a more inclusive empire.
But instead, he walked right into a trap.
A tragic irony.
His motorcade, it made its way through the crowded streets, surrounded by cheering crowds, but hidden among them were the assassins, young men ready to strike.
History poised on a nice edge. So it's June 28th, 1914, Sarajevo, beautiful summer day. Franz, Ferdinand, and Sophie, they're riding through the city, open-top car.
Yeah, not a lot of protection there.
Must have been, I don't know, kind of surreal, right? Knowing the tension, the threats.
It's one of those moments, we look back and we know it's coming, this huge tragedy.
And they had no idea.
Just surrounded by crowds, people cheering, waving flags. But in that crowd,
The assassins.
young men,
Oh.
determined, ready to change the course of history.
And it's crazy how, like, one little thing, one wrong turn, can have such massive consequences.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what happened. Their motorcade, it took a detour.
Just a small change in the route.
Yeah, but it put them right in the path of one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip.
19 years old, Serbian nationalist.
He'd almost given up hope, of getting a clear shot.
And then fate intervenes.
A wrong turn, a stalled car. Suddenly he's got his chance. Princip steps forward, pulls out his pistol, fires 2 shots.
2 shots that changed the world.
One hits Sophie right in the abdomen. The other, it hits Franz Ferdinand in the neck.
Severing a major artery.
It was chaos. People screaming, diving for cover. The car speeds off towards the governor's residence, but
Too late.
Sophie collapses, mortally wounded. Her last words, they were, "What has happened to us?"
God, and Franz Ferdinand, he's holding his throat. He cries out, Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children.
It's heartbreaking. All the politics, the ambition, it all fades away in that moment. Just raw human tragedy.
So much lost in an instant. So what happens next? The Archduke, his wife, they're dead. What does this mean for the empire, for Europe?
Well, it was a shockwave. I mean, the entire world felt it.
Yeah.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were devastated, outraged. They saw it as an act of war.
And they blamed Serbia.
Immediately, they issued this ultimatum to Serbia.
Backed by Germany.
Yeah, a list of demands, really harsh, basically designed to be rejected. They wanted to punish Serbia, crush their nationalist movement.
It sounds like they were looking for an excuse to go to war.
A lot of historians believe that's exactly what it was. They saw this as a chance to, reassert their control in the Balkans.
But Serbia had allies too.
Yes, Russia. They weren't going to back down without a fight. And so we have this web of alliances. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia mobilizes. Germany declares war on Russia and France. Britain joins in to defend Belgium.
And just like that, the world is at war.
A regional conflict explodes into a global catastrophe. Millions dead, the map of Europe redrawn.
All because of those 2 gunshots in Sarajevo.
And a wrong turn. A moment of opportunity. The ripple effect of one event.
It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? How these individual lives, these choices, can have such massive unintended consequences.
And it makes you wonder, what if things had been different? What if Franz Ferdinand had lived, had a chance to implement his reforms? Would we have seen the same war?
We'll never know, of
Yeah.
course. But I think that's part of what makes history so fascinating, all those what-ifs.
It's a reminder to learn from the past, to understand how these forces interact, how even seemingly small events can have a global impact. Maybe by understanding that, we can, avoid making the same mistakes.
I hope so. Well, that was a really thought-provoking deep dive. Thank you for walking us through all of that.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the past, present, and future. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it.